The Great Depression was an immense tragedy that placed millions of Americans out of work and brought the American economy to one of the lowest points in history. After nearly a decade of optimism and prosperity, the United States was thrown into despair on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the day the stock market crashed and the official beginning of the Great Depression. As stock prices dropped, panic struck amongst American citizens. Masses of people tried to sell their stocks, but no one was buying. The stock market, a prior way to earn money in the economy, quickly became the path to bankruptcy. However, the stock market crash was just the beginning. Since many banks had also invested large portions of their clients' savings in the stock market, these banks were forced to close when the stock market crashed. Seeing banks close caused another panic across the country. People feared they would lose their savings, so they rushed to the banks left open to withdraw their money. This massive withdrawal of cash caused additional banks to close. Those who didn't reach the banks in time were unable to recover any of their savings and became bankrupt. Businesses and industry were also affected by losing much of their capital in either the stock market crash or the bank closures, so many businesses started cutting back their workers' hours and wages. In turn, consumers began to reduce their spendings by refraining from purchasing things like luxury goods. This lack of consumer spending caused additional businesses to cut back wages or to even lay off some of their workers. Even with these cuts, some businesses still couldn't stay open, so they closed down, leaving their workers unemployed. As businesses failed, the government created the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of June 1930, which raised U.S. tariffs to historically high levels. The tariff was originally intended to help protect domestic farmers against agricultural imports. Because during World War I, countries outside of Europe experienced an increase in their agricultural production. Then after World War I, European producers stepped up in their production as well. Therefore, massive agricultural overproduction occurred during the 1920s, resulting in a decline of farm prices. President Hoover therefore pledged to aid American farmers and others by raising tariff levels on agricultural products. However, the tariff's passage did not help to end the Great Depression at all. In fact, it caused more suffering. It became a symbol of policies designed to improve one's own lot at an expense of others. This and other policies contributed to a drastic decline in international trade, specifically with Europe. U.S. imports from Europe declined from 1929 high of 1,334 million to 390 million in 1932, and U.S. exports to Europe fell from 2,341 million in 1929 to 784 million in 1932. So overall, world trade declined by about 66% between 1929 and 1934. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff fostered distrust amongst nations, leading to less cooperation in both the political and economic realms. In previous depressions, farmers were typically safe from the severe effects of a depression because they could grow their own food supply. However, during the Great Depression, the Great Plains were hit hard with both a drought and various destructive dust storms, creating what would become known as the Dust Bowl. Years and years of overgrazing combined with the effects of a drought caused the grass to disappear. With just topsoil exposed, high winds picked up the loose dirt, destroying everything in their paths, leaving farmers without their crops. Small farmers were hit especially hard at this time. Sharecropping had already put many farmers in debt as they borrowed money for seeds and paid back the money once their crops grew in. When the dust storms hit and damaged their crops, not only could the small farmer not feed himself and his family, but he could not pay back his debt. Banks would then foreclose on the small farms, leaving their family homeless, unemployed, and hungry. By 1933, about 1/4 of all workers in the United States were unemployed. The men of the family felt feelings of shame, guilt, and anger as they blamed themselves for lack of work. This upset the psychological balance of traditional families, undermining their male role. Not only were farmers feeling the effects of the Great Depression and assimilating into associations like the Farmers' Holiday Association in 1932, but the World War I veterans were too. In 1924, Congress had agreed to pay a bonus that could be collected in 1945, but as the Depression deepened, veterans demanded their bonuses early. Hoover rejected their pleas, and when they refused to pay, more than 20,000 veterans formed the Bonus Army and marched in Washington, D.C. President Hoover reacted by ordering General Douglas MacArthur to remove the veterans from the Capitol grounds. The U.S. economy broke down and entered the Great Depression during the presidency of Herbert Hoover. Although President Hoover spoke of optimism throughout his term, the people blamed him for the Great Depression. Subsequently, Franklin D. Roosevelt won the 1932 presidential election by a landslide. As soon as Roosevelt took office, he closed all banks and reassured he would only open them once they were stabilized. He also began to establish programs known as the New Deal. The New Deal was a set of federal programs containing 4 primary goals, specifically economic recovery. The New Deal helped to stabilize banks and clean up the financial mess left over from the stock market crash of 1929. It also stabilized prices in the industrial and agricultural businesses and aided the bankrupt state and local governments. Roosevelt promoted a huge amount of federal spending in order to balance supply and demand totals as well. Second, Roosevelt focused on creating jobs, as 1 in 4 Americans was out of work by 1933. The New Deal created a number of special agencies that provided jobs for millions of workers and wages that saved many. It also recognized the rights of workers to organize in unions. Roosevelt also invested in public works by building thousands of highways, bridges, schools, theaters, libraries, city halls, homes, post offices, airports, and parks across America, most of which are still in use today. And finally, Roosevelt improved the morale of society by improving lives overall for ordinary people and reshaping states, cities, and towns. In less than a decade, the New Deal changed America's economy and laid a foundation for success and prosperity for the future. Programs of the New Deal included the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, which provided funding to farmers, the National Industrial Recovery Act, NRA, which provided for codes of fair competition to regulate industry, and for the first time in American history guaranteed the rights of labor to bargain collectively. The Public Works Administration, PWA, which constructed roads, dams, and public buildings, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which served to insure deposits in banks, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, TWA, which provided for navigation, flood control, electricity generation, and economic development in the Tennessee River Valley, which was one of the poorest and least developed regions of America at the time. The government also set up a special work program for the unemployed in the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, whose members planted trees, built public works, drained swamps to fight malaria, restocked rivers with fish, worked on flood control projects, and a range of other work that helped to conserve the environment. Also through the New Deal, the government refinanced mortgages, provided emergency relief for Americans who could not then support themselves, regulated the stock market through the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and provided Social Security to America. The New Deal also provided many more projects and programs to alleviate the suffering brought on by the Great Depression. Although Roosevelt did what he could to end the Depression, he was unable to foresee what would later happen in 2007 when a 21st century recession occurred. When comparing the two, there were a lot of similarities, obviously reflecting poorly repeated economic decisions. Throughout both occurrences, unemployment rose. Although rates were higher during the Depression, unemployment still rose in 2007 as well. In addition, there was a tax increase, a loaning of money from banks, a stock market crash, manufacturing decline, easy credit, and a reliance on industries during both occurrences. However, there were some major differences between the two. For example, only 0.6% of banks failed during the recession, while 50% of banks failed during the Depression. Also, while loans to other countries played a major role in the Depression, mortgages played a major role in the recession, meaning mortgages were being used but not paid off. Another major difference is that there was not as drastic of an industrial production decline in 2007 as there was throughout the 1930s, meaning the economy held up better in the industrial world in recent years than in past years. Although both the recession and depression had their flaws, there was always someone there to fix the economic bloopers. In fact, there was a plan to fix both the recession and depression. Roosevelt was responsible for creating and administering the New Deal, while the stimulus plan was created in 2007 while President George W. Bush and later President Barack Obama were in office. There were many similarities between the two plans. For example, both of their first priorities was unemployment. 8 million jobs were created through the New Deal via the WPA, and almost 700,000 jobs were created through the stimulus plan. Both plans also affected the private sector of the economy, and the government also encouraged businesses not to invest during this time until the economy was stabilized. The government focused on circulating money and completed a lot of recovery methods through government spending. In the 1930s, the government spent $500 billion, while in 2007, the U.S. spent $700 billion. Citizens in 2007 received personal tax cuts and rebates, and the financial and automobile institutions stayed afloat during this time without government bailouts, showing that the economy was much more stable during the 21st century rather than in the early to mid-1900s. So, overall, the 2007 recession was a lot less harmful to the economy of the United States than the Depression of the 1930s, as noted by the high percentage of bank failures and industrial collapses throughout the early to mid-20th century. However, the government continues to learn from these repetitive historical mistakes regarding our economy year after year as the United States changes with culture, developments, and the rises and falls of the industrial nation. Each year, presidents become more and more confident of their ability to turn the economy of the United States toward the right direction, leading their country to a prosperous future. An interview was made with Keith Duett, a financial advisor and tax lawyer. First question: what are some of the main causes of the economic downturn in 2007? His response: banks made outsized bets in certain security markets and ran into liquidity problems when the bets turned against them. This caused a cascade effect as banks and other financial institutions started doubting the ability of one another to make good on the bets. Question 2. How did the banks react? The banks turned to the Federal Reserve to inject liquidity into the system and mediate a settlement system. In short, the banks asked the Federal Reserve, and by extension, the American taxpayers, to bail them out. Question 3. Could they be prevented? Yes, the Federal Reserve should have exercised its regulatory authority to prevent the banks from making the outside bets in the first instance. Question 4. How did the government step in to help? The Federal Reserve injected massive liquidity into the financial system and forced stronger banks to purchase weaker, failing institutions. It is debatable whether the government actually helped by doing so. If you think that giving someone enough rope to hang themselves is helping them, then I guess the government has been very helpful. Question 5. Did the government's plan to help work and help return the economy back to its normal ways? No. Despite historically low interest rates and unprecedented money printing by Federal Reserve since the financial crisis, the economy continues to perform weakly. Unemployment and food stamps usages are at unacceptable levels, for instance. In my opinion, the government's action has prolonged the crisis and made it more painful for the American people. The government should have allowed the financial institutions to fail, creating a market-clearing event that, while painful in the short term, would have set the stage for robust economic growth going forward. Question 6. Why is there such a big federal deficit? It is easy to spend other people's money, and politicians are very good at it. As the late Margaret Thatcher said, the problem with socialism is that sooner or later you run out of other people's money to spend. And question 7. How did unemployment affect our economy during 2007, and what is it doing to the economy now? Unemployment is one of the primary indicators of the health of the economy. The unemployment rate presently is dismally high, especially when the ranks of those who have left the labor force because they cannot find jobs are considered. The economy will not recover until businesses gain the confidence to hire, and it is difficult to see this happening anytime soon under our current administration's policies.